This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the show for the very first time, Carol Rutter. Welcome.
All right, good to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you about the subject at hand today. You have a book that actually just came out called Lying Abroad, Henry Wotton and the Invention of Diplomacy. Here's my...
That's right. There he is on the front cover, the little man in black,
Yes.
sitting next to the Doge in the Collegio in Venice.
Yeah, this is such a beautiful cover too. And I got the advance proof copy. So does the final copy look the same?
It does, but even better, on the inside flap, it has the map of Venice so that you can see the very map that Arrigo Vuttoni commissioned while he was still in place in Venice to take home with him as his great souvenir of having been there for 6 years in place as ambassador.
Wow. His story is quite fascinating, and it's one I really knew nothing about coming into this book. And I would love to know, what was it about Henry that got you to do a book on this? Because it seems like there's so much to cover, but how did you look at this and go, this is a whole book?
Well, you're absolutely right. You've known his name. Everybody knows his name. He's one of the most well-known ignotos, unknowns of the Tudor period, because he's the man who gave us the definition of the ambassador as the honest man who lies abroad for the sake of his country. So we know that definition of an ambassador, and he's always a footnote in other people's biographies. I came upon him because I'm a Shakespearean, and all Shakespeareans know the story of the burning down of the Globe Playhouse in 1613. And he's the man who wrote the letter to his nephew to tell him about that event that happened on the Bankside on that day. So we all know his name, but we know very little about him per se. And when I started investigating him from the point of view of being a Shakespearean, I came across a life that sometimes looked like Shakespeare comedy, sometimes looked like Shakespeare tragedy, frequently looked like Shakespeare farce. And I just became fascinated to know more about this man, not least because he took me back to the start of my academic career, which was in archives, looking at theater records. And for the end of my career, I wanted a big project that took me back into the study of dust, but also took me to Venice. And he was the man who absolutely did that, because he eventually was appointed ambassador to Venice in 1604. But we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
Shall I tell you where I started with this man?
Yeah, because I feel like in the book, there is a lot of information about his life before, like his growing up and how he eventually became an ambassador. Let's start from the beginning.
That was simply because I wanted to know how you formed the mind of a future ambassador. How do you build an ambassador in 1590? So I began by thinking about, well, who was his family? They were close to royalty. They were local gentry in Kent. But his father had survived through 4 regime changes of the Tudors and clearly wanted a life now of retirement. Even when Queen Elizabeth came to Buckton Malherbe and asked him if he would come to court, he said, "Thank you very much." She planted a tree there, which is still there on the site, but declined the offer. And his little boy, Wotton, was 5 years old when Queen Elizabeth came to stay that weekend. Wotton was the youngest of his father's 4 boys by a second marriage. And he was 20 years younger than his oldest brother. So he was a kind of pup in a second marriage, who was going to inherit nothing. His big brother, Edward, was going to inherit the estate. So he had to start looking out, or he had a father who had to start looking out for how this young man would proceed in the world. Well, what I think was probably optional for young men in the 1570s, by the 1580s had become absolutely a requirement, and that was education, a humanist education at school. So whereas the big boys in the family had all been educated at home, Harry first of all, was educated by his mother, who taught him the mother tongue, but then started learning Latin, as all grammar school boys would have done, and eventually then, at 11 years old, was sent out off to Winchester College, 100 miles away from home, in order to start getting the grounding in what was by then, I think, the internet for that period, which was Latin learning. Everything that was needed to be known across Europe was now available in Latin texts. And so he was learning the grammar, the education of that school to teach him, to ground him in the things that he would need for his future. From Winchester College, he then went off to Oxford, to the university. And again, that was a fascinating new venture, because the men who were coming up in his generation were men who were not being trained for the church, as was the traditional pathway through university, was to become a theologian, to become a scholar, to work inside the church. No, these are going to be men who were secularists, who were going to learn how to run the country, who were going to be advisors to the king, who were going to be what we would think of now as the civil service. So he was up at Oxford until he graduated with a BA in 1588. At Oxford, he had some fascinating this is also the story of this man's life. He had chance encounters that were absolutely foundational in who he was going to be. His family was Protestant, and he came in contact at Oxford with Alberico Gentili, who was the internationally known expert on international law, who was writing at that time the 3-volume book on legation, on how to be an ambassador. And he took little Harry under his wing, taught him Italian. And I think, the book that he was writing was in print when Harry was at Oxford. I think he probably gave him some of this book to read on how to be an ambassador. So it's there in the book, but it's also a time when a mind is significantly being formed by the people he's coming in contact with. He graduated in 1588. You remember 1588? 1588, significant year. What's happening in the summer of 1588? I'll remind you.
Yeah.
The Armada sails up the English Channel. And the Armada's design, of course, is to get to London, to depose the heretic Protestant Queen Elizabeth, to set up in her place a puppet queen, a good Spaniard, and to restore Catholicism to England. Now, I imagine this is part of the filling in the gaps, if you will, of the historical knowledge of Henry Wotton. I imagine that he has gone back to Kent after graduation, and that he's there on the day, standing on the cliff tops at Dover, watching the Armada sail up the Channel. The Armada is defeated, as England says, by the grace of God, by the hand of God. But nevertheless, you can see young men. He's 20 years old now. He's right at the prime of youth, saying, what am I going to do with my life? So that's the next chapter. What am I going to do with my life?
One of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, your time working in the archives, and I feel like this book is so littered with so many pieces of history, so many letters that he wrote even early on in his life. Was it overwhelming, the number of things that you found?
Well, when I got to Venice, had I known how much there was there, I would probably have been totally daunted. But because I was an ignoramus, as he was ignorant when he got to Venice for the first time, I didn't know what was coming. And I had come to know him and his family by only a handful of letters that survived from the time of between graduation and his appointment to Venice. And those letters really covered a period between 1589 and 1594, when he's traveling on the continent, because of course that's the thing that is going to prep a young man for the next stage of his life. If he's not going to be a cleric, what's he going to do? He's going to have to work probably as some great man's secretary, if he can land a really juicy job as some great man's secretary But in order to do that, he has to travel. He has to go onto the continent and explore other places, other cultures, other ways of thinking, other ways of speaking. By the time he leaves England in 1589, he knows Latin, he speaks English, he's completely fluent in Italian, speaks a bit of French, and knows that he can pick up German on the way. High Dutch, as it's called. So he spends these years now traveling across Europe for 5 years in different courts, different libraries. Part of what he's doing is he's continuing his studies and lands a place in the Imperial Library in Vienna and is there with thousands of books and manuscripts, and it's just absolutely mind-blowing. And comes in contact with some expat Englishmen who want to use his services to inform him about things that are happening across Europe. He goes to Venice for the first time as a tourist. He's there in the months that the Rialto Bridge is completed. So again, notionally, one thinks of his feet being some of the first that crossed that bridge and polished that marble into its whiteness. But he also decides that he's going to take a trip to Rome, which is a hugely problematic and dangerous enterprise for a Protestant lad traveling across Catholic Europe, because, of course, the Inquisition of Rome is fierce, and it will arrest him. It will put him into the prison of the Inquisition. So he decides that he will go to Rome. Well, then again, the lifetime of Henry Wotton. Why, you just have to laugh and love this young man. He decides that he will go into Rome disguised. And his disguise is that he puts on this huge hat with a fantastic blue feather and rides into Rome underneath this hat and blue feather. And he knows that he will be completely unknown as an Englishman, because no Englishman would do that, and that everybody will be pointing at him and know that he can't possibly be an Englishman, and that he'll be safe. He has some close shaves while he's in Rome, and eventually has to escape, get out of town quickly before he is detected. But once again, he's telling a story about trying to acquire knowledge, information, which is not through books, but about direct experience, talking with people, learning how they think, which is he is absorbing and becoming part of the fundamental equipment that he is going to use for his future serving various politicians.
One of the things that I learned from your book, which kind of surprised me because I don't really study at least the late Elizabethan period as much, was during this time when he was over there, Elizabeth I had removed everybody from her embassies. That was a big surprise. So he was going into something different that previous, let's say, diplomats would have experienced abroad, right?
Well, absolutely. In fact, there was no embassy in Venice. There hadn't been an embassy in Venice for 50 years. Because when Elizabeth came to the throne, the Pope at that point gave her a couple of years to work out whether she was going to maintain the Catholic right of her sister, her big sister Mary, or whether she was going to pursue the Protestant heresy, as he called it. And so now you have each side calling each other heretic, of course.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
The Pope, after about 5 years, issues a papal bull and excommunicates Elizabeth. And at that point, Venice, who is situated, in a relationship with Rome, but maintains its independence of Rome, decides to be politic and wait to see what happens. And so they wait for about 50 years. But in between that business, it's not as though she's withdrawing her ambassadors so much as she's just not reappointing them. And she does have ambassadorial relations, because there is a French ambassador in London, and she will eventually, send somebody to Paris. It's just that this is not the focus of her attention at the moment. She's got bigger problems, and the bigger problems circulate around the man that Henry Wotton comes back from his travels and lands a job with, and that's Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He's described as the Star of England, the Icarus of England, by William Shakespeare, of course. And when Wotton returns from the travels in 1589, he is employed. I'm sorry, I've got that date. When he returns from his travels in 1594, right at the end of 1594. Partly, I think, because of his big brother putting in a good word for him, he's taken up as the personal private secretary to the Earl of Essex, who sees that Wotton can offer him a real fast track into information about Europe. At this point, Essex seems to have adopted his dead father-in-law's position as intelligence gatherer for the crown. We call it spying. Well, it wasn't, because it's information gathering. It's called intelligence, and you inform yourself in order to be able to inform decisions. And in order to do that, you have to have people on the ground who are giving you information. Is that information true, false, maybe rumor, maybe not? Which is why Wotton's actual experience is so important. But becoming the personal private secretary to Essex means that he's at Essex's right hand constantly. So when Elizabeth comes to grief, again with Spain, it's Essex who decides that maybe they should take the war against Spain into Spain's territories. And they go on this extraordinary adventure. I mean, real boy's own, but hugely prepared and well provisioned raid on Cadiz to intercept the Spanish gold fleet. Then after that, the next big problem for Elizabeth is trouble in Ireland. Always trouble in Ireland. The Irish rebels, or shall we call them freedom fighters, who want liberation from the English crown and do not want the plantation of Ulster and so on, under their great general Tyrone, are kicking up real problems yet again. This just goes in cycles over and over again. And Essex, who has been critical of most generals who have gone and failed in Ireland, including his own father, complaining about this, Elizabeth finally says, okay, well, you do it. And over his dead body, Essex is sent to quell Ireland, to defeat Tyrone. Again, Wotton is with him. We have it in his own hand. His letters are there, writing to his friend, the poet John Donne, about what's happening in Ireland. But as Essex's right-hand man and secretary, he's the one who, on the day Essex sends to write out the treaty, the negotiation of a truce with the Earl of Tyrone. Why this truce? Well, I think that probably Essex was on land in Ireland for about 3 minutes when he realized that they were absolutely on a hiding to nothing. He expected, if you're going to have, an army, that an army meets an army, right? You stand up against each other and fight. That's not the way the Irish fight. They fight as a guerrilla war. They know where the bogs are. They know where the solid land is. The English keep falling into the bogs and drowning. Their horses aren't any good. They're not prepared. The shoes aren't right. The provisions that they've brought are all wrong. And the people in Ireland, that is the English who are situated there in order to defend English interests, these men are also in revolt because they know they can't win. So I think that the Irish campaign opens Wotton's eyes, on the one hand, to the constant demands the Queen is making from London. Why haven't you defeated him? Why haven't you set up this? Why haven't you done this? Why haven't you... Those demands, which are absolutely pie in the sky compared to what's on the ground, and then watching Essex try to negotiate all of this business, I think he probably learns an awful lot about the claims of politics and an absolute monarch who can make demands that you as a subject have no hope of ever being able to fulfill. Of course, what eventually happens to Essex is that he decides that he is going to try to get back to England to present himself personally to the Queen, to be able to explain against all of his detractors who were there at court, those carpet generals who've never lifted a musket, who've never walked a mile in a bog, to try to salvage his reputation. And of course, that ends disastrously. We all know the story of Essex, storming into the apartment of the Queen when she's just up, and the hair about her face is that immortal line, the hair about her face. And it looks like everything is going to be fine. Then Essex is arrested. He's in prison. Well, he's in house arrest for another year. Where is Wotton in all of this? Well, of course, he rode back with him. He was there on that mad dash back across the Irish Sea, across England, to get to the Queen. What happens to all of Essex's followers in that year? They probably hang around Essex House wondering what in the world is going to happen. And then Essex does that even more fatal thing of deciding in February of 1601 that once again he's going to try to get at the Queen, and he marches ahead of a group of 200 armed men into the city of London. He's arrested, and he is executed within a couple of weeks. Arrested with him are 3 out of 4 of his secretaries. What isn't there? Where is Wotton? Well, my guess is that because his big brother, Edward, is now the controller of the king's household, having inherited that job from the last years of Elizabeth's reign when he was head of the household, that Edward probably knows what's happening and that he gets word to his little brother. And there's a story about him being spirited away, put on a boat, crossing the channel, released in Calais, and scarpering. And then he winds up then as an outlaw because he has no license to travel, as an exile in the court of the Grand Duke of Florence, Ferdinand de' Medici, offering his services to a foreign prince.
Wow, that part of the story I absolutely loved, where Essex is arrested and Wotton is like crossing the channel, or like he is ahead of schedule. He's like, I am getting out of here before everything goes down. It seems like his connections, like you said, with his brother, all of those people that he knew helped to keep him safe in that instance, didn't they?
Yes, well, that's why on the one hand, I think of him as this a kind like Essex, a kind of golden boy. And they were only 3 years apart in age. It's another thing that we need to keep remembering. These were all young men. But he was a sort of a golden boy, like Essex, except that he kept having his reputation be tarnished by things that he did that looked, if not disreputable, well, very close to being disreputable. When he arrives in the Medici court, he has been to Florence before. He knows the person that he's talking to. I mean, he knows about the person that he's talking to, and of course, he can write and speak beautiful Italian. But at this point, he also learns of the execution of Essex. And where before he was merely somebody who had run away and knew himself to be in exile, now he offers to serve the Medici by giving them information on England. And at that point, he sounds very much to me like a turncoat, that he's going to be a spy for Europe on his home. And he says, he's very bitter about the fact that my master was killed. My master was killed by men who were dishonorable. It turns out, of course, that he's not very far from the truth when we learn years later the role of Robert Cecil in the execution of Robert Devereux. But at this point, this man who seems to be heading for such a glorious career in the service of the Star of England, now is away from home. Who knows how he's managing to feed himself? He's alone. No, that's not quite true. His big brother sent his own son with Harry, I suppose, to keep tabs on him. But there he is without an occupation, now trying to scrabble a living. What happens next then in this story is absolutely, well, Shakespeare couldn't have dreamed it up. It happens that somebody goes to the Grand Duke, Ferdinando, and informs him that the King of Scotland is going to be poisoned. That's James VI. James Stuart of Scotland is going to be poisoned, which means that the Florentines have got to get to Scotland a box of antidote for this poisoning. Okay? And it's the Grand Duke's secretary who says to the Grand Duke, "I think I know just the man to do the job." He happens to be in your court at the very moment. It's Henry Wotton. So Henry Wotton is deputed to take this box of antidote post haste to Scotland to hand over to James. Well, of course, he can't travel through England because he'll be apprehended and sent down, obviously. So he travels in disguise as an Italian, Ottavio Baldi, and goes not the normal way that you would think of, just kind of crossing the channel at Calais and then going up the Great North Road. No. He has to go all the way around the Alps, the other way, through Germany, cross through Denmark, get up through Scandinavia, then cross the Irish Sea, which is such a brutal sea that King James thinks that it's inhabited by witches. He gets over to the other side of Scotland. I mean, it's an incredible journey that he takes, all in disguise. Discovers that the king isn't where he's supposed to be, so he has to travel even further on horseback. Taken into the court, still in disguise, whereupon he is disarmed because the king, who has a whole history of assassination attempts on his life from the time that he was a babe in arms, does not see foreigners alone. Certainly does not see foreigners armed alone. When he's presented to the king, he is surrounded suddenly by all of these armed Scots who are defending the king. He speaks to him as Ottavio Baldi, but then steps forward and whispers in the king's ear, "I am an Englishman and I need conference with you." The king is absolutely delighted. King James himself loves a great theatrical. He allows Wotton to stay in the court for 3 whole months, from September through that winter, 3 whole months. I imagine then, and we don't have a record of this, but I imagine what happens is that he gets to know King James VI very well and his habits. On the one hand, a man whose chief delight in life is to go hunting. And on the other hand, a man who loves books, who loves disputation, who loves writing long treatises on the rights of government and so on. So you have this kind of ambidextrous king who doesn't spend a lot of time actually ruling, but chases things and writes things and reads things and so on. And then he is allowed to leave Scotland as true an Italian as he came hither. He goes back then to the Medici court and is hanging around the court. This is now late 1602, and as we'll all remember, Queen Elizabeth dies in March of 1603. Yeah. James takes the English throne as James VI, the first of England, keeps the old Queen's household more or less intact, and says to his head of household, Edward Wotton, by the way, do you know somebody called Henry Wotton? And Edward, I guess, says, yes, he's my little brother. And the king says, well, wherever he is, call him home. Now, we don't have Edward's letter that he clearly has written to Harry, who at this point is actually in Venice, calling him home, but also giving him some very good advice. And that advice is to write to Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil is the Secretary of State for Queen Elizabeth, the son of Lord Burleigh, the great foundation stone on which Elizabeth rested her entire career. That son is now Secretary of State and more or less running not just regime change, but running England. The king goes hunting. Robert Cecil runs things. And I'm imagining that Edward has said to his brother, you've got to make your peace with Robert Cecil.
Yeah.
Because you are an outlaw. So Harry writes a letter that's an extraordinary letter. For me, it's his first real experiment in diplomatic writing. A letter that he writes to Robert Cecil that has to say, on the one hand, I'm sorry, but can't admit the fault, because if he admits the fault is treason. Yeah. So he balances this letter in extraordinary fashion. He goes home, meets the king. The king embraces him as his most honest dissembler. And within a year, he has sent Harry back to Venice as the ambassador to restore Anglo-Venetian relations that have lapsed for the last 50 years. And that's because the king sees himself as Europe's peacemaker, as the Rex Pacificus. He wants peace across Europe. He wants peace with Spain, and he wants to set up peaceful relations across all of Christianity, whether we're Catholics or Protestants, peace across the Christian world. So off goes Harry, now back to a Venice that he pretty well knows now, and is set up with his entourage of 7 young men whom he takes with him as his suite, a chaplain, a secretary, and other young men who are going to serve the embassy. And they set up in Venice this little Protestant enclave. It's the only official Protestant address in Venice, on Cannaregio, which is a long way from San Marco, but is planted in a very busy part of the city where everybody can keep eyes on this maverick Englishman and his entourage, who are now planted in the middle of Venice. And then starts the next chapter of his career, where Henry Wotton, spy, student, soldier, secretary, scoundrel, begins the life of his own regime change, which is to become the English ambassador to Venice.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to ambassadors, that's something that I'd heard the title so many times. I know that they would go to specific company or countries. And then from there, I had no idea what they do during their time as ambassador. Can you go into that a little? I mean, you kind of alluded to it.
I mean, as Alberico Gentili wrote the textbook on it that I think Henry Wotton read. The point of an ambassador is to be a messenger and to help with trade. So the first messengers historically are angels. And angels are the one God deputes to carry messages to humanity. So you see it in all of the Annunciation portraits where there's Mary with a book, and then there's suddenly an angel bringing her a message to do this, right? So that's one job, the angelic message to take from on high into the subject position. But the other is to enable trade, right? To set up relationships that are going to enhance the trade of both nations. The role of an ambassador, though, is to be absolutely selfless. You have no position yourself. You never speak for yourself. You are always speaking under instructions from your master, who in this case is the king. And that means that you have to wait for instructions before you speak. Correct?
Yes.
Sets up a problem because the postal service between Venice and London across the Alps, 21 days to get a letter to London, 21 days to get a letter back. That's 6 weeks where an ambassador might be treading water like mad. Okay. I can't say anything off my own bat. I must wait. Well, what happens as politics become increasingly fraught in Venice is that our friend Arrigo begins to act off his own initiative. And that's why I see him inventing diplomacy, because he literally can't wait. He knows that he is invested in the person of the king. He wears the king's, the livery of the king. He is dressed for the king. He stands up and speaks for the king. But when he starts to go off king's text and suggesting things off his own back, then of course he's in the territory of diplomatic disaster, really. Now, for the first year of his embassy there, everything is pretty well normal transactions. Okay, his biggest business is to talk about ships. The Venetians are incredibly exercised about English piracy in the Mediterranean. Okay? Under Elizabeth, the privateers, as they were called, were permitted to attack the Spanish gold fleets. Elizabeth licensed them. She even took a cut. Anything that they could pirate, she would take some of the cargo. Of course, James then establishes peace with Spain. And all of these men who had made their living as privateers now no longer have a source of income. And what they do is they move their business down into the Mediterranean and start attacking ships across the Mediterranean. Okay? The Venetians are, I'm simplifying this enormously, but the Venetians are severely exercised by this and want it to stop. So there is the big issue for Wotton. How do you recognize a ship at sea?
A flag, right?
Well, a flag, but you can put up a different flag, can't you?
Yeah.
Flags are very, very easily to dissemble, correct? And so what is now going to be the procedure for recognition at sea? They argue this backwards and forwards for 14 months. The other big issue is taxation. And the argument is that the English are being taxed too much in Venice for just loading cargo, for discharging cargo in Venice. The Venetians say that's not true. We're being charged so much in London that we've stopped actually shipping stuff on our own ships. So an argument about the anchorage tax and who is going to pay this, that, and the other. That drags on. It is so mind-numbingly boring. You cannot believe it. Of who said this and what happened there and did they do that and somebody was pirated and how did you know it was a pirate? And of course, what is problematic in all of this is that the Mediterranean is a kind of Babylonia. Nobody understands everybody. You've got multiple nations all on the same ship. And if you're hailed by an Italian, but you only speak English, there is no way you can make yourself recognized to this other ship. So they start firing, they start shooting. This goes on for the first year of Henry's appointment. And then something else big happens. We get to November of 1605. You remember November of 1605, a big date. Not only are distances huge, we also need to remember that the calendar in Venice is different than the calendar in England, because the calendar in England has adopted the new calendar, whereas we're still on the old calendar. So the dates are 10 days apart. If it's the 1st of November in London, it's the 11th of November in Venice. What happens reported on the 15th of November to Venice? Well, we think of it as the 5th of November, and it's the gunpowder plot.
Yes.
So the gunpowder plot to blow up the entire royal family is known by the Venetian ambassador who is now staying he's known to that ambassador who reports it back to Venice before Henry ever hears about it in Venice. But the other thing that happens at the same time is that in Rome, the Pope, the new Pope, Paolo V, the papacy is in a bad way. The three previous popes have only lasted a matter of months. Pope Paulo V, the Quinto, comes to Peter's chair unbelievably, can't believe that he's there, and decides that it must be a mission to clean up the church. And so one of the things that he does is targets Venice. And he targets Venice because Venice are, to his mind, withholding illegally 2 priests that should be sent to Rome charged with crimes and tried in the papal courts. And Venice says, no, these men committed rape, defamation, murder. They will be tried. These are civil crimes, and they will be tried in the civil courts in Venice. And the other thing the Pope is exercised about is that Venice has put an injunction on people leaving property to the church in Rome. That is, leaving their houses. This is a city built on water. Property is really hard to get and hard to take care of. So handing it over to the Pope is becoming a real problem. And they've decided that they're going to spread this whole idea across the whole Veneto, not just in the city of Venice, but across the whole Veneto, which is Padua and all the way, to the papal territories. The Pope gets very angry about this and decides that what he is going to do is to issue what is called an interdict. That is, he is going to excommunicate the entire city. He issues this interdict that says to his priests, no more baptism, no more confession, no more marriage, no more funerals. All marriages that are conducted are now illegal. All children born are bastards. Nobody can have extreme unction to be buried. So the whole faith side of the city is now to be held under this fulmination of the Pope, who clearly intends this to act upon the people, the populi of Venice, so that they will rise up and force the Senate to agree to what the Pope wants. The Senate says, no, we're not going to do that, and tells its clergy, you just keep on working. And if you don't, you can leave. Or you can be hanged. So this is now going on, which is a huge confrontation between the Pope in Rome and the Venetian Republic, who clearly sees its rights of sovereignty being attacked by the Pope under the threat of a religious issue. Okay, Harry hears these 2 things and attaches them to each other. The gunpowder plot, which is an attack on the sovereignty of the king in England. The interdict, which is an attack on the sovereignty of the Republic. He is delighted. He thinks this is great news because he sees that what might come out of this resistance of Venice against Rome is that Venice will become Protestant. That the Protestant revolution that has happened, across Germany and parts of France and in Switzerland and so on, that it will arrive crossing the Alps into Venice, and that indeed the Venetians are halfway there. They are nearly Calvinists in Harry's mind. So off he goes. His job as ambassador on a day-to-day basis is to go to the Collegio, which is the group of about 30, including the Doge and his inner group of advisors, who listen to ambassadors. Ambassadors bring their audiences, their exposizioni, to the Collegio. They tell the Collegio what is on their king's mind. They listen to the Collegio. The Collegio then takes their exposizioni, which have been all transcribed verbatim, over. They discuss it in the Senate. The Senate then brings the information back. The Collegio then informs the ambassador of what to do next. But it means that there's always a buffer between the ambassador and the real seat of government, which is the Senate. So the collegio is this place between where he gets to speak into the ear of the Doge, who also presides over the Senate, but is kind of an indirect route. They like indirection in Venice. If anybody's ever been to Venice, you will know they really like indirection. Anyway, on this particular audience, Wotton goes to the collegio and he says, we've heard what's happening. We've heard this thing that's supposed to be being kept secret, but everybody in Venice seems to know about it. And I have to tell you, a papal interdict, excommunication, it's not worth a farthing. Weren't we in England under a queen who was excommunicated for 50 years? And what happened to us? Tell the Pope that he can go and take his interdict and leave it on the papal chair. Okay. And so now, not only is he excited by the idea that he can help the Republic resist, what he proposes is that he is going to mobilize his Protestant king to be the great defender across Europe of Venice. And so that's the next part of his story about how he continues for the next 15 months that this interdict crisis, as it's called, goes on backwards and forwards. And is the king, is the Pope going to mobilize? Is he going to send armies into Venice? What is Spain going to do? Spain backs the Pope. Is France going to come on side, good Catholic side in France? Is it going to jump in with the Pope and oppose little, what's going to happen? And how is Protestant Europe headed by King James? Remember, he likes to go hunting. He does not like war. He hates the idea of a soldier. How is Henry going to mobilize this king who's known as he's the most timorous king in Christendom? Well, the only thing that King James is more afraid of than war is an attack on his sovereignty. So this whole business about his divine appointment to rule as sovereign might be being attacked means that he's going to lend his power to Venice in the interdict crisis. And it goes on and on and on and on for about 15 months before an accommodation is finally reached. The Pope backs down. The Protestant Revolution doesn't happen, but because Wotton has done this invention of diplomacy, having completely off his own bat, without any instruction from the king, proposed that the king would be at the head of a League of Nations in defense of Venice. That completely explodes in Wotton's face. But he survives. And the interdict ends, and the Collegio, the Doge, can say that it was because of Wotton and because of the king, as Wotton says, it was all the king, that they had really enough, at least on paper, enough vocal power to resist the Pope and that huge mass of Catholic Europe that was standing behind the Pope. So this is what an ambassador does. He sometimes flies very close to the sun. I always see Henry Wotton with one foot on a banana peel, and that he's constantly slipping and falling and then getting up and somehow recovering his position. Partly, I think it's because he is genuinely, and this comes through in his correspondence, he is genuinely charming, genuinely witty, genuinely without any sense of self-importance. No, he's always doing a job for his monarch, for his crown. But he's also always very clear about the prestige of his, what we're now calling Great Britain, the prestige of that Great Britain to be able to represent Great Britain to Venice.
I'm fascinated by him because I feel like he lived through so much amazing history, but was also part of that history in a way. one of the things you haven't really brought up much yet is his life as a poet, maybe. Do you want to talk a little bit about his poetry at all?
Well, everybody writes poetry. Earl of Essex writes poetry. Um, uh, Wotton has a young man that he met at university. When this young man was only 12 years old, he arrived in college when he was 12. Wotton is 4 years older than he happens to be John Donne. So
Mm.
if you have a friend like John Donne who's writing poetry, your occasional poetry is going to stand in somewhat of a shadow to that greater amount of poetic output. But he writes as a as a uh, as a university student, he writes this kind of despairing poem about some girl who's thrown him over. And it's practically there are only 3 or 4 places that we get any sense of Henry Wotton's erotic life. But more importantly, while he's at university, he explores the poetry of Tasso in the Jerusalem Liberated, Jerusalem Liberata. And he translates this great epic poem into Latin to be performed as a university play. I would say probably his major contribution to the history of poetry. And it's lost. We don't know what it is, but it shows him working through Italian poetry into Latin verse, then performing that in a theatrical setting with all of the great, campaigns and warfare, the liberation of Jerusalem by, the Christians, and what all of that means as a young man, again, forming ideas about where Christianity and Christian Europe should stand as against thinking of the real inverted commas heathens, which are, of course, the Turks, who are potentially going to overwhelm Europe. Now, having said that he survives, that he's a great survivor, maybe we should just kind of mention his last great moment of near total disaster, which is also a part of the writing that's being done by his king now. That feeds into the whole history of his own writing and poetry and making verses, making hymns to our Father, and so on. After the gunpowder plot is dealt with, inverted commas dealt with, King James decides that he had better write a treatise about this in order to defend what he has invented, which is an oath of allegiance that he requires all Englishmen now to take to defend themselves against the perfidious Catholics. I mean, perfidious, that is the unknown Catholics who might be, along with Guy Fawkes and others, trying to overthrow the kingdom. So he writes this long treatise on the oath of allegiance, and he circulates it, and other kings across Europe poo-poo it. And then he decides that he'd better write something even stronger. And he writes then a premonition that's going to be attached to this oath of allegiance. It comes to us by the shortened title of the King's Book. And in this premonition that he writes for more than 150 pages, it's just the prologue, is written, directed to his brother kings in England, across Europe, saying, beware, your sovereignty is under attack, beware. But as part of this, he doesn't just kind of give them warning, he then starts to attack Catholicism, and it's nasty. It's not just joking, it's defamation, it's scurrilous, it's heretical. He has this book that he's so proud of, bound in velvet and a golden clasp put on it, to be sent to all his brother kings across Europe. In Venice, Harry thinks that the Collegio is going to love it. Okay? The Collegio, the Senate, has advance warning because the Venetian ambassador in London has seen a kind of a pre-copy. So he knows what's in the book. And he informs Venice of what's coming. So already Venice has decided that what they're going to do, because they are politically so adept, they will accept the book, thank him for the book, and as soon as he has left, they'll take the book, hand it over to the great chancellor, who will put it into the secret archive under lock and key, and nobody will see it. Anyway, the day comes and Harry presents the book. He's delighted with the reception of the book. He goes home and writes to Robert Cecil about how overjoyed everybody is to get the king's book in beautiful red velvet. And then a couple of days later, he discovers that the book has been withdrawn, that it's not being published in all of the booksellers and so on. And he sends somebody in disguise to find out whether this book is available. And the guy says, well, no, we don't have it right now, but we can get you a copy, a clandestine copy of this book. So he's now furious that the book has been accepted, but then withdrawn. And he marches into the Collegio, demanding that this be changed. It happens that the Doge is not in the Collegio. He's ill. Leonardo Donne, who always cuts Wotton a great deal of slack, is absent. Anyway, he makes his demand. He marches out of the Collegio. He waits 3 days. He then demands audience again and says, "You've done nothing." And they say, "Well, no." He says, it becomes really aggravated, very, very, very heated. Again, Donne is not there. So what Henry Wotton does next is extraordinary. He says, right, if I cannot serve my king as an ambassador, I quit. And he literally takes off his robes and says, "You can consider me now a private man." And he marches out of the Collegio, now having resigned as ambassador. They, of course, go into, they don't, they never do sort of emergency in Venice. Venice operates in this kind of calm, but what happens next looks really like it's going to be a catastrophe, because they decide what they have to do is they have to get a message to London to tell the king what has happened with their ambassador. This is going to be a huge, huge diplomatic catastrophe. So they get a staffetta. Literally a staffetta is a stirrup. He's the courier. I've said that it takes 21 days to get to London. This man, Carrara, gets there in 9. We have no idea how many horses he kills. Gets there, sees the Venetian ambassador. The Venetian ambassador goes and talks to the king, tells the king what has happened, that your minister has resigned. The king goes, "Oh dear," sends a message back. But by this time, Wotton clearly has decided that he's made an absolute buffoon of himself. Uses the excuse of this extraordinary messenger to say, well, my honor has actually been satisfied and the honor of the king has been satisfied. So I'll come back to you as ambassador. And when he comes back as ambassador, Leonardo Donne is there and says to him, "You had no business doing that." He welcomes him, but is very severe. And he basically says, an ambassador is a mezzani. He is a go-between. And it's the same word that is used amongst courtesans for a pimp. You are your king's pimp, the go-between. That's your job. And you may not resign without instructions. But then he says, and this is where I think, Wotton is always somehow on the banana peel, but coming up roses. Donne says, "It's too bad I wasn't there, because I would not have accepted your resignation." So he's back, in business again, but he writes to Cecil saying, "I realize that I have lost all of the credit in one morning that I have gotten by hard work over 6 years." And at that point, Henry Wotton, I think, begins really to show how homesick he is, and he just wants to go home. So for the next year, He is trying to get his king to give him permission to come home to sweet England.
Oh, Carol, this has been so fantastic. Like, you are such a great storyteller. I feel like so often we hear the story of the royal court, not all of things that are going on behind the scene. And I feel like your book shows us all of the happenings behind the scenes, all the negotiations, the friendships, all of those types of things. And if you're watching or you're listening to this podcast right now and you want to understand how diplomacy worked, I highly recommend that you grab Carol's book. And I'm going to show it again here. It's called Lying Abroad, Henry Wotton and the Invention of Diplomacy. Carol, if somebody wants to get a copy of this, where can they grab one?
I think it's available through Amazon online.
Okay. And there's more to his story. We didn't cover everything here
No, he
today.
didn't. I mean, he wound up late in life, wonderfully for the last 15 years of his life. He was the provost of Eton College.
Yes.
He became the head of a college and instructed boys on the best way of living. I find
Yeah.
that wonderful.
Yeah, what a great ending to such a fantastic man that I feel like history kind of shoved into the shadows just a little bit.
Well, I hope I've kind of raised him out of the canal and brought him back into the light, the Ignoto, who now I hope is a little bit better well known.
Yes. Carol, thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tutorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.